Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Goin Digital Show, the podcast for K-12 school leaders. I'm your host, Greg Goins, and we're excited to be back in 2017 for the first time after an extended winter break. But that also brings some new changes, some exciting changes to the Goin Digital Show. We're very excited to announce that the Goin Digital Show is now part of the Education Podcast Network. So if you've ever been looking for the very best podcast in the field of education in one place at one time, all you have to do is go to edupodcastnetwork.com on the net, and you can also find us on Twitter at edupodnet. So a big shout out to my colleague, Chris Nessie, the founder of the Education Podcast Network, who's also the host of the House of EdTech, certainly a show you want to check out. But you can not only find the Goin Digital Show on the network, but you can also find great shows like Instructional Tech Talk, a podcast hosted by my friend Jeff Herb, who's an elementary school principal in the Chicago area. So be sure to check out the Education Podcast Network, podcast for educators, podcast by educators. So we are thrilled and honored to be a part of EPN, and hopefully there are great things to come for all the podcasts on the network in 2017. So as we kick off our very first show of 2017, we're honored to have a very special guest join us. Matt Miller is an outstanding teacher in the state of Indiana, and you're all familiar with Matt as the author of the wonderful book, Ditch That Textbook. And Matt is a certified Google innovator. He's also a popular keynote speaker, and we're thrilled to have you with us today, Matt.
Hey, I'm thrilled to be here kicking off 2017 with you guys. So thanks for having me.
All right. So everyone, if you're not familiar with the book, Ditch That Textbook, you need to run out and get that as quickly as you can. Just an innovative look at engaging students in a 21st century classroom environment. So Matt, if you could just kind of kick things off and tell us about the book. And it's been about a year now since the book came out. What's the response been?
Yeah, actually, we're coming up on 2 years because it was in, I think, April of 2015. And the response has been overwhelming, more than I had imagined that it would be. It's funny because I wasn't even really looking to write a book when I started it. And I reached out to my publisher, Dave Burgess, and was just looking for some ideas on, doing presentations to teachers. And he was like, I really think, he said, I know I'm talking to the Ditch That Textbook guy when I say this, but I really think you need to write a book. And I was like, well, who's going to publish me? And he goes, I will. And so that took about 2 minutes to decide. And so since that came out, it really has been phenomenal. And I think people really have sort of resonated with the idea of not so much like I have to throw away my textbook, like my textbook in and of itself is evil, because that's not really what it's all about. But it's more about how can we teach less from the textbook as like our bread and butter, as our kind of like guiding document, so to speak. Because I know when I started teaching, it was kind of like, here are your keys, here's your textbook, now go to work. And I wasn't sure exactly what to do or where to go from there. And so I did a lot of just marching through the textbook chapter by chapter. And so I think that's kind of what my focus on Ditch That Textbook was, is that we don't have to do that. We don't have to march chapter by chapter through. And there's a lot of things that we can do that are better for learning for kids.
And Matt, I tell this story a lot, but I think it was last year for Digital Learning Day. We tried something new in my district, and I'm a superintendent in Southern Illinois of a K-12 district, and we did a Ditch That Textbook Day just to see if our teachers could adapt to that. And it was very interesting, like you would expect. Some of our teachers were very excited about it. Some of them were a little resistant, but the thing that I found that I didn't really know how the kids were going to respond, but the kids absolutely loved it. The fact that they could go a full day without having to open that book. So we think about doing what's best for kids. That has to be something that we have to think about every day in that classroom environment.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. And, it's got to come back to, just like you said, what is best for kids. And I think that sometimes it's easier for us to think about what's easy for us. And we don't really think that we're thinking that way sometimes. But it's like, we could continue to teach in sort of the same old ways that we always have. Teachers for years and years and years have done the stand up in front of class and lecture, and have, made the photocopies of the worksheets and passed out and everything. And I'm starting to wonder how much learning actually comes from that stuff. because I've kind of shifted my focus to what is the best return on investment that we can get. Because in education, if you think about it, from K to 12 is 13 years, 180 days, and roughly 7 or 8 hours or something like that we're there. And if we're going to invest all of that time into our lives, then what are we going to get out of it? And if we're standing up in front of class and we're doing a lecture and you've got maybe 30% of the kids who are really listening to you, and then how much are they really listening? It's like, what amount of learning actually comes out of that activity? And then that also, I think, begs the question of, if we're doing that activity, but there isn't really much learning coming out of it, can we really call it teaching? And so I wonder if some of those safe teaching practices, when we think that we're being safe by doing that, are actually sort of like a little bit more risky, in that whenever it's easy for kids to check out and it's easy for them to not pay attention, then they're not actually learning from it. Then what are we really doing? It's kind of like we're just doing all of this activity, but we're not really getting anything out of it. So yeah, I think it's just like you were saying, I think it's sort of a mindset shift, a mindset shift. Gosh, I need another cup of coffee this morning.
And I think those are great points. And not only do we talk about ditch that textbook, but I know you and I have been on social media a lot over the last couple of years talking about ditch that worksheet. We've got to get out of this mindset that we're just going to make kids sit in that hard chair in that straight row and just do busy work all day. I mean, it has to be a dreadful experience to go through that if you're a young student.
Oh yeah, totally. I was listening to a podcast by Don Wettrick called Start It Up, and he talks, I've heard him say this in keynote presentations before too, how he knew a teacher that at the beginning of every year, they would get out their year. And by their year, what that meant was it was this big, fat, thick binder with all of these photocopies in it. Actually, I think he said they were dittos. They weren't even photocopies. That's how old those were. And what he would do is he would pass all of those dittos out to the students, and he wouldn't let them write on them, because he was going to collect them and he was going to continually use them. And Don always says that he remembers this quote from his dad, who was a lifetime educator. And he said, "Don, I don't care if you teach for 20 years, just make sure that you don't teach the same year 20 times. And I feel like when we get into that worksheet mentality, that's sort of what we're doing. And again, it's like that's what's imprinted in our brains, and it's simple for us to follow that same pattern that we've always done before. Even when it's not necessarily better for kids. I keep seeing more and more research on the devastating effects of kids sitting all day. Mm-hmm. And I know it's the same way with me. And they do, like fMRI scans of your brain, and they show the brain activity whenever you've been sitting and learning versus when you've been up and moving. And I know even for me, if I get stuck in a rut and I'm trying to think of a blog post to write, or if I'm, thinking of new activities that could be done in the classroom or something, if I'm totally in a rut, I'll get up and I'll go run. Because, for me, I'm a runner. And so I'll get up and I'll go out for a run. And when I come back, I literally have to go run to a whiteboard or a notebook, and just, because I've got all these ideas just kind of oozing out of my brain, and I've got to capture them before they disappear. And so there's a lot of truth to that. And I just fear that, like you said, when we get into that worksheet mentality, we're kind of pinning ourselves into this sort of rote way of instruction. And to stick with that idea of pinning, we're pinning kids' rears to the desk, to the seat, so that they can't get up and move, which is so good for their brain.
Yeah. Now, you and I have been connected for quite some time via Twitter, but we actually met in person this past summer at ISTE in Denver. And yes. I was walking through the exhibit hall, and I look over and I see you in your yellow Ditch That Textbook T-shirt, and you are working for one of the vendors there, and you were giving these short presentation bursts, 15 or 20 minutes at a time, and then you were signing books. And so I dropped in to say hello, and you signed a book for me, and I appreciate that. But just kind of a funny story, we were about a month away from our ed camp here in Southern Illinois, and there were several copies of the book that were scattered across in the seating areas. And so I went through and I picked up probably a half a dozen books or so, thinking I could take these back as door prizes for the ed camp. But one of the people working there at the vendor hall grabbed me and said, "Sir, one at a time." So they caught me right off the bat. But the good news is we were able to get several books, and they were a wonderful prize at our Ed Camp. So for people that haven't had a chance to go to ISTE and an event like that, can you kind of break it down and tell them what they could expect?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I wish that I knew about as a newer educator, because you've got some of these great big education conferences. You're talking about ISTE, and like in Florida, they've got FETC, and in Texas, they've got TCEA. And so you've got some of these really big ones, and they're a great resource. There are lots of little ones, I mean, just scattered all over the country that are wonderful resources too. But by golly, if you get a chance to go to one of these big ones, it's amazing. Because for me, one of the first things I noticed was, as I walked in the door, I started recognizing people from that little bitty circle picture, that little bitty picture on your Twitter account. So I started seeing these profile pictures, like real life faces matching up with these profile pictures. And I thought, my goodness, my entire Twitter feed is walking in the halls of this convention center in Denver. And I remember before I got to go to ISTE, I would watch the hashtag on Twitter, and I would watch people tweet, and I kept thinking, oh man, I hope that they share a lot of the stuff that they're learning. And I kept seeing selfies of people, and I kept seeing who they were getting connected with. And I thought, I was really frustrated, because I thought, my goodness, I'm out here and I could be learning from these people. And what are they doing? It's like, is that all that they're doing all day? Is they're just taking selfies and they're just hanging out with people? And then I started going to some of these conferences, and I started to realize that's kind of why you go to these things. And that's kind of one of the best things that you can get out of it. Because you can go to all of these different sessions on pretty much any topic that you can imagine to gather ideas, which is great. And that was a breath of fresh air for me early on in my career. I was like a sponge. I just couldn't get enough of these new ideas. But then as I started to do it a little bit more, I started to realize that the connections with people, being connected to somebody who teaches a specific thing, or teaches in a certain way, or has a certain philosophy about education, and then I could go reach out to them later, or I can connect them with somebody else. And I started to realize that the ideas are great, but the connections with people are powerful and empowering. And I think for me, that's what I really get out of a conference like ISTE.
And the big news here for us in Illinois is in 2018, ISTE will be coming to Chicago. And I know that's not far from you, where you're at in Indiana. So I know we're both looking forward to that experience. So we're talking today, it's March 21st of 2017, and you're getting ready for a very exciting new adventure. You're going to speak in Australia. So this is your first international keynote experience. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I'd love to. This was one that kind of came out of the blue for me. And I've been sort of all over the United States doing keynotes and full day workshops and breakout sessions at conferences and stuff, and have never been outside of the United States. And so here comes this one. It's at this cool conference called the Teach Tech Play Conference. It's a conference put on by teachers, by a group of teachers, who just have been to other conferences before, and they feel like they have a good picture of what teachers really need. And so it's a 2-day event, and I'll be doing the keynote presentation on the second day. But what I'm really excited about is I'm going to get to go see Sydney for a little while, for about 4 or 5 days or so beforehand. And the conference is in Melbourne, so I get to go there after Sydney. So I'll get to see Australia with my wife for about a week or so, and then we'll go to this conference. And so pretty exciting stuff. I'm not looking forward to the trip though, because it's going to be almost like a full 24 hours in transit to be able to get there, but hopefully it'll be worth it.
Yeah. Did you ever think that you would go from teaching Spanish in Indiana to being a keynote in Australia here, 3 years later?
No, that was beyond my wildest dreams. So it's a pretty exciting opportunity.
Yeah. So I don't know a whole lot about the Australian education system. So do you have any idea what the expectation is going to be? You think it's going to be very similar to the experience you've had in the States, or what's your thought process?
I've learned a little bit about it. And from what I understand, there's there's a little bit more of an emphasis on private schools than public schools. So I think those are a little bit more prevalent. And I know that especially among those private schools, there's lots of competition. And so everybody wants to at least have the appearance of being a, strong, academic, rigorous school. And it's interesting because one of the presentations I'll get to do while I'm there is called Ditch That Homework, which is actually a piggyback off of a book that Alice Keeler and I are writing that should come out in June. And the organizers of the conference contacted me and said, hey, we'd like to do a press release and let the press know that you're going to be speaking about homework and about how you think that there should be less reliance on it. So they send out these and I started to get contacted by the media down there in Melbourne and a couple of other places. And I did some interviews with the radio down there, and they were talking about that very thing, about how even though they could see the value in relying less on homework and finding strategies to get away from homework, they said a lot of the schools down here are in such steep competition for for students that even if they thought that it would be better for learning, they might even say, we're still going to continue to do it because it gives the perception. They might not come out and say this, but that it gives the perception of a more rigorous instruction. So I think there are a lot of similarities when it comes to the Aussies in that, learning is learning, kids are kids, teachers are teachers. There's a lot of similarity there though.
And, I think there's been a lot of great conversation and debate, if you will, about homework in general the last year or so. And
Mm-hmm.
and I'm still I understand both sides of the argument, and I certainly understand that there is an element of repetition on things like learning basic math skills, and obviously reading is going to be very important. But I also know that a lot of kids just don't have the support at home, and the more we can do at school, I think the better it's going to serve our kids. What are your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. From my own teaching career, I started to see a lot of things that concern me. Alice wrote in the book about how she had a student come up once that just very bluntly said to her, we all copy your homework out in the hallway, right? And I think there's a lot of that. And just like you said, it's a tough situation to put parents in to be a surrogate teacher. And so if they struggle and their kids come to them and need help, especially when you get to be older, and it's more complicated stuff, they're especially, parents that are of lower socioeconomic that just maybe didn't have that education. For us, we're trained in education. So, when we've got kids that come to us that need help for homework, it's instantly something that we can help them out with. But I just feel like, and I think this is sort of the premise of our book, that there's a lot that we can do to become more effective and efficient in the classroom so that we don't need to rely on the homework as much. Now, do we need to absolutely, from moment one, quit homework cold turkey? I don't know that that's the best way, but I think that especially with some of the things that we can do with technology, but then also with other best practices and some things we're learning about brain research and how the brain works, the way to optimize some of our instruction, I think that we can make it stick just as easily and just as well without the homework sometimes as we can by having kids take home homework. So those are sort of my general thoughts there.
Yeah. And I know that you also spend a lot of time talking about technology in the classroom, and I would consider you to be a technology coach. I don't know if you would consider yourself that type of
Sure.
Advocate or not, but let's talk a little bit about your work as a Google innovator. What are some of the questions you get from teachers and educators when you go out and speak, and how can you help them implement things that they can use today in the classroom?
Yeah. So, a couple of things on that. I know whenever I go and do a presentation, and I was this way whenever I would, and still am, whenever I'm a participant in professional development, I see a lot of teachers get overwhelmed pretty quick. You go to a conference and you hear presenters speak and you think, oh my goodness, there are all of these ideas. This person's doing A, B, and C, and this person's doing X, Y, and Z. And that guy over there, I don't even know how he sleeps, and you start to get all of this stuff. And I used to ask myself, am I doing my students a disservice by not implementing all of these things? And I think the answer to that is resounding no. You're not doing a disservice to your students if you don't pick up on every new gadget. And as I've gone deeper into my education career, when I was in the classroom, I became more and more judicious about what I would let in front of my students. I mean, it had to seriously move the needle significantly before I would let it in my classroom. And I didn't want to just, bring things in and try them just because they might work. I wanted to have a clear picture before I would bring something in. And I think that there's something to sticking to a kind of like a core small group of digital tools as opposed to using a whole bunch of them, because students are able to get comfortable with them. We get comfortable with them. And then there's less of the mentality of, now I have to learn the technology before I can use it to learn. And I think if we can stick to those kind of like core, that handful of tools that we want to use, I think that that's good. And then the other thing that I think I see a lot of is that, and I think this happens especially with Google Apps, we get kind of a narrow focus on what those apps can do. And we'll look at Docs and we'll think, oh, well, Docs is for writing essays. And we'll look at Slides and we'll go, oh, well, that's for doing presentations in front of the class. But if we can open our minds up to what else those tools can do, like one of my favorite ones to share in presentations is how you can use Slides to do kind of like stop motion animation. You set up one slide and then you duplicate it and you move something just a little bit. And then you duplicate it again, you move something just a little bit. And when you flip through all those slides really fast, it's basically like creating animation. And then the sharing aspect of Google Docs, whenever you do a slide presentation, you give every student a slide. And then you share that presentation. And then every kid has their own slide where they can do their work. Yet you're working within a document that's created by the whole class. It's like we're all working together in this shared space. Little things like that, I think, where if we can open our minds up to the possibilities of the tool, there's a lot more that we can do with it.
And, I think it's a good thing now that, Google just came out with information that Google Classroom is going to be more available to everyone, not just those that have the network. So, that has to be a good thing if you think about bringing people to those type of programs.
Oh, yeah. No, I totally agree with that. That was, I thought that was a huge announcement, something that I know a lot of people have been waiting for. I know it has an impact on the homeschool community and with, teachers that want to do Google Classroom where their school district isn't bought in on Google Apps. And, it was one of those things where it was kind of like for the select few who had bought in on Google before. And now, and that sort of seems to go with Google's philosophy of let's create great products and make them available to everybody for free. Right. And so I think it just kind of falls in with that same philosophy. And yeah, I think that's huge. I agree with you.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit with you about your website because I think it's fantastic. And is it ditchthattextbook.com?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. And the great thing about it is, you have regular posts, which is very important if you're going to have that resource, but you're also providing, information for teachers, professional development, if you will, that they can actually take back and use in the classroom. You can buy the book there. You can even buy t-shirts there. So talk a little bit about your website and what your goal has been with that.
Yes, absolutely. So I just, within the last month or so, had my 4-year blogiversary. So I've been at this for 4 years now. And you're just like you said, my goal has been to post regularly. I try to do it on Mondays and Thursdays. Just providing things that are practical for teachers. And I know there are lots of education blogs out there, and some of them are kind of like inspiration things, and some of them are personal reflection things. And I've always found that my readers find the practical ideas they can implement in class tomorrow to be the most valuable. And so that's the general focus of my blog, is to try to come up with ideas that you could use in class and show you how you can use them or how you could adapt them to your own situation. Although I do, go from time to time onto bigger picture things of trying to create the kind of education that we need for to prepare students for the future that they're going to face. And so, and it was sort of a big leap for me to even try this. And if anybody out there is thinking about starting a blog, I think that it's been enormously valuable for me, because the comments in it allow me to engage in a discussion with people and to hear other people's perspectives. But I think what's even more important for me is that it has allowed me to think through the ideas that come into my head in a more formal way, in written text. And I think whenever you create something for other people and you put it out there, it really forces you to think through what you're talking about and really kind of educate yourself on it and go through the entire thinking process instead of just having a fleeting thought. And so those are some of the things that I found that have been really great through that.
So as we kind of wrap it up, Matt, tell us when the book comes out. And if you could, just talk a little bit about Dave Burgess and what he's been able to do as a publisher, because I know that they're producing a lot of great books that have educational content. I just had a chance to meet Todd Neslony and Adam Welcome in person at the ICE conference in the Chicago area a few weeks ago. And they were talking about just the impact that Dave has had in creating all these wonderful opportunities for new publishers.
Yeah. So to answer your first question, that the next book, Ditch That Homework, we're hoping will be out by June in time for ISTE, and that is published by Dave Burgess. And the reason that I have come back to him and I'm so passionate about their mission is that they're kind of taking the education publishing world, I think, and turning it on its head, where if you had an idea before that you thought would resonate with other people that you wanted to share with the world, you kind of like had to be discovered by a publishing company, or you had to get accepted to publish by the publishing company. And they're that way to some extent too, but they're not so controlled by so many factors. It's basically Dave and his wife Shelly are the two main partners in it, and they're just looking to help people tell their stories. And so if you have an idea and you reach out to them and they decide to publish your book, then all of a sudden you go and you write it and you have full creative control over what you want to have in the book and how you want the cover to look and all of that. I know traditional publishers a lot of times have their hands in what that final project or a product looks like, and they are a dynamo when it comes to helping promote your stuff too. So I'm passionate about their passion, about what it is that they're doing, because I feel like we're hearing more people's stories and more people's takes and twists on education. And so really excited to be involved with them too. Now, if I could real quick before we wrap up, you mentioned the Education Podcast Network earlier, right? And a friend of mine, Casey Bell, and we have a podcast in that very same network. It's called the Google Teacher Tribe podcast. And we're always doing the same sort of thing, trying to give people practical stuff that they can take home and use in the classroom related to Google. So I thought since we were talking podcasts at the beginning, I thought I'd throw that in there too.
Well, that's great. I'm glad that we are brothers in podcasting then.
Yes, sir.
Be sure to check out the Education Podcast Network, because really some amazing things and great content there. So Matt, thank you so much for being here today. Just as a closing thought, where can we find you on Twitter, and why should people run out and buy the book?
Okay, so on Twitter, my handle is jmattmiller. It's the letter J, Matt with 2 T's, Miller. And the book, I feel like it's something that will empower teachers in a practical way, but also sort of in a theoretical way to provide the kind of education that I know that kids are going to need in this future that they're going to. So that's my big pitch for the book right there.
Well, thank you again so much for being here. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and you're doing amazing things. And run out and get that book, ditch that textbook, and be looking for the new book coming out later in 2017. So Matt, thanks for being here. And remember, you can always find the Goin Digital Show on demand on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher Radio. I'll also be pushing this out through our Twitter feed at Goin Digital Show. You can also check out the website, drgreggoins.com. So for Matt Miller, this is Greg Goins, and we want to thank you for listening, and we hope to see you next time on the Goin Digital Show.